Okay, so this evening for RCIA, so we're happy to have everyone here. We're going to go through the entire Bible in 1 hour. Everyone has like a blank sheet that is in front of you, and that sheet is going to be very helpful because what we're going to do is fill it in. And so my recommendation is as you go through, so angles may be a little bit tough for some of the people on the edges, but as you go through, so you've got essentially a blank template that's there. The only thing I've given you are dates, and so the dates will work their way through. And we're going to start filling that in by describing persons and events, and then also books of the Bible, and then other, so we're going to classify them into historical books, prophetic books, wisdom books. But the idea of taking notes, does everyone have like a pen or something so you can write stuff down? If you don't, say something and we'll see if we can't get you a pen. Because one of the advantages of actually taking notes yourself is that this will then become your own reference. And so especially by jotting these things down, it'll help you to recall these things. But then later when you pick up a Bible and you say, this book of the Bible, I wonder what this has to do with, and then you discover that name of the book of the Bible in your notes, then you'll say, oh, here's where it fits into this entire history. So you have 3 pages of blanks. So first page, back of the first page, and second page. So it's a 3-page, the way that it's all spread out, and we're going to fill it all in tonight before we're done. All the way from the prehistory, all the way until 70 AD. We're going to do it all. Okay. Are you ready? Okay, here we are. We'll start with the prehistory. Name a person or event that you might run into in the early part of the Bible. Like in the book of Genesis, some of the first people that you might run into. This is interactive, so the camera's on me, not on you, but I want to hear from you. So who's the first people that you would meet in the Bible? The first people created by God, Adam and Eve. So we first have Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Okay? And then after that, they had children. Do you remember what the names of their children were? Cain and Abel. Okay, so we've got, and this is all in the book of Genesis. So one of the things that you can do, and I just put arrows to trace this down because the book of Genesis is going to contain a lot of information here. So it's not going to be just about Adam and Eve alone, but the book of Genesis, and then we'll have Cain and Abel. You remember Cain and Abel? Adam and Eve, the important thing there is as they were created by God, that they were made for each other. Remember that Adam did not have a suitable helpmate. He named all the different animals and he was given dominion over the earth, but it was important that he have someone to share that with. And so God made for him a partner, bone from his bone, flesh from his flesh, Eve. He built up Eve. And then they had children after the original sin. So after they were then expelled from the Garden of Eden for eating the fruit in the center of the garden that they were forbidden to eat, so taking the knowledge of good and evil, their eyes were opened. Suddenly they realized that they had sinned. They realized that they were naked. And so God made clothes for them and then said, now get out. Okay, so that's get out, you're done. So they had to leave, and now they had to labor and work on the earth in order to feed themselves instead of all of that being provided for them. They had children, Cain and Abel. Did they get along? Anyone? Did they get along? No, they did not get along. Okay, I'm doing my best Ferris Bueller here that I can. So Cain and Abel, do you remember who did what to whom? One, they offered sacrifices, and one of them sacrifice was better than the other, and one of their sacrifice was not accepted. So who was jealous? Cain. And so what did he do? Well, the only sensible thing. Well, I'll kill my brother then, right? Okay, so the first fratricide, the first homicide was committed in the scriptures as Cain slew Abel, and then Cain had to be punished for that. So there was a punishment for Cain. Who else would you run into? Maybe the next really big story in the first pages of Genesis. And I call all of this prehistory, incidentally, because I don't have a specific date that we can connect this to. You might say that some of this is kind of in almost sort of mythological time before we get to kind of more predictable dates of that make up part of history. But so another person in sort of this prehistoric, this very early period of time, maybe someone who maybe built something. Maybe someone who they made a sequel of a movie about that really wasn't any good, or that's what it is. What was the one about Evan Allman? Anyway, I don't know.
No.
Yeah, it was awful. Okay, so yeah. So then we have Noah. So Noah and the flood. Remember that God had looked down on humanity, saw all of sinful humanity, and said, well, Noah and his family were righteous, and say, I will save Noah. And so told Noah to build an ark while the flood was going to come and wash away the rest of sinful humanity. Some of this is actually going to be very important with respect to the sacrament of baptism later on, because in baptism, the waters of baptism, like the waters of the flood, wash away our sins. It's not quite as dramatic as drowning everyone on the face of the earth, but there you are. But so you have Noah and the building of the ark. Anything else that would have come from that period of time? I can't remember if I put anything else in here. There would have been the Tower of Babel. Okay, so I did throw that in there. The Tower of Babel would have come from this period of time. People wanted to build a tower to go up into the heavens, but God said, oh, we can't let them do that. So they confused their language so they couldn't understand each other. And so the project fell apart. It's all in the book of Genesis. So all the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Okay, so we're through the first part of Genesis. Who'd be the next major figure? Now we're talking about kind of a historical figure, and we're going back all the way to the 1900s BC. Someone who was a father figure, the father of a nation, the leader, a patriarch like Abraham. So we have the patriarchs. So patriarchs from patris or pater, which just means father. Patriarch are father figures, or the fathers of the nation. We have Abraham, who came out of Ur of the Chaldees. He was sent forth to the promised land. He trusted the Lord when the Lord called him out and told him where to go. Abram then also had with his wife Sarai. They were both given new names, so they became Abraham and Sarah. And of course, they had like so many children, right? There was what was the problem? God promised them that they would have children that would be more numerous than the sands of the shore of the sea, but they had no children. And were they young? Were they old? Anyone young or old? Old. Very good. Okay, that's my Ben Stein. I'm trying hard here to do that. Okay, so so they were quite old, quite advanced in years. And so they said, what does this mean? You're going to make my name a blessing for the nations and multiply our descendants and give us this promised land. But what good is it if after I die there is no one? And so out of this came Ishmael. There was the story about Ishmael and Hagar. That's all from this time. But eventually, though, and the promise of God was fulfilled, they did have a son, and that son's name was Isaac. Okay. Isaac then married Rebekah. So Rebekah, a wife was found for Isaac from their people. And so Rebekah was found and then brought to Isaac. So Isaac then married Rebekah. And Isaac had a ton of sons, right? No, he didn't. He had one son. Which son did he have? Does anyone know the son of Isaac? Jacob. Okay. So then we have Jacob. And actually there were the two sons, Jacob and Esau. So there's a famous story about the twins, seeing who could come out of the womb first. Remember who was the firstborn, Jacob or Esau? Jacob or Esau? Esau. But Esau, however, was his birthright. He was ready to sell it. Do you know what he sold? He sold his birthright away. He gave it away. Do you know what he sold it for?
Porridge.
A bowl of porridge. Yeah, well, when you're hungry, I guess. So, if that's whatever you got to do, I guess. So that's right. So he sold it to his brother. So Jacob was the one who actually inherited the birthright. He was the one that inherited the blessings. So the blessings and the promises given from Abraham to Isaac, Isaac then to Jacob, not Esau. This is not the first time, incidentally, when God chooses not the one you expect, not the oldest. So that happens more than once. So a couple times when that occurs. So Jacob actually has two wives, and their wives have two maids, and between the lot of them all together, they have 12 children. Okay, 12 sons. Okay, so between Leah and Rachel, you then have 12 sons. So the 12 sons of Jacob then become the father, each one of them becomes the father of a tribe. And so from this you have the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay. And this is maybe another little note to make, is that when you say Jacob, Jacob was given a new name. Remember I said Abraham was called Abram and he was given the new name Abraham? Jacob was also given the name Israel. So Israel is a person, but Israel is also, you can say, a nation. So when they say the 12 sons of Israel, you're talking about 12 descendants from one man, Jacob. But you're also talking about their descendants then become tribes, and cumulatively those 12 tribes form the people of Israel, the sons of Israel, or the sons and daughters of Israel. So Israel is in here. I did not actually put the word Israel here, but that's, so this is all part of Genesis. And then of the sons, the last of the sons, the one who was the most beloved by Jacob, Israel, the one who the brothers were all jealous of because he had a technicolor or something or another, I forget the story. No, that's, and that was Joseph. Okay, so we had Joseph, and his brothers were so mean to him that they did the only thing that was logical. They wanted to kill him. Except they stopped. Oh, see, we've matured a little bit since Cain and Abel. They said, okay, well, we don't have to kill him outright. So let's sell him. That's even better there. So let's sell him into slavery. And he was sold off to the Ishmaelites. That's an interesting little thing, because who was Ishmael? The other descendant from Abraham, and so there's a connection back there. But anyway, so he sold off to the Ishmaelites and he was brought down into Egypt. So Joseph was sold into slavery into Egypt, but eventually he rose to become a very important person and helped not only the Egyptians, but helped all of the civilized people to endure a great famine, including his 11 brothers, who then came to beg for food, and little did they know they were asking their own brother. So it's really a great story. It's a fascinating story, lovely story, the Joseph story from the latter part of the book of Genesis. So anyway, so there's food in Egypt, so what do they all decide to do? They all go down to Egypt. Okay, and everything's all perfectly harmonious until Jacob dies, and then Joseph dies, and then other people come along, and this is now the time at which, here's a modern map where we are. So we're talking about them emerging from the promised land, which would be this area around Jerusalem. Jerusalem didn't exist yet at this point, but this area, and they would make their way down into Egypt. Okay, and that's when they became to be known as the Hebrews, which actually is a word that means slave. So to speak of them as the Israelites or the Hebrews, we're talking about the same people, but now eventually we have to get them back to the promised land. So now we're now up to around 1440, the approximate time of who was the figure that was going to help get them out of Egypt. They were going to exit Egypt, so which you might find in the book of Exodus. Okay, and so then we have the Exodus. So Moses leads them out of Egypt. So the book there is going to be Exodus. Okay, I put more stuff down here. So he's ready to lead them out of Egypt. Remember, there were the 10 plagues. Pharaoh, this is to convince Pharaoh to let the people go. And then he was hard of heart. Pharaoh's heart was hardened there. And so plague after plague after plague, and they said, no, you can't go. Until finally the last plague, and the last plague was part of a ritual that was given to them in which they would have to sacrifice a lamb. Remember the name of the ritual at all? The famous Jewish ritual still with us today. Passover, yeah. So Passover comes from this time of people being led out of Egypt. Then eventually Pharaoh threw them out and chased them all the way up to the Red Sea. And what happened at the Red Sea? There they were backed up against the sea. They were going to be slaughtered for sure. You have nowhere to run. You're done for. There's no hope, except that then the Lord parted the waters of the Red Sea, and then Israel, when the Hebrews went through, Israel went through the waters of the Red Sea and emerged free instead of slaves. They left slavery to Egypt behind and emerged as freeborn sons of Israel on the other side. They went to the Holy Mountain, and there God said, here, take these 2 tablets and call me in the morning. So, no, that is such an old joke. I have to, I don't know, I try to keep you laughing, and just because we have to do so much so fast here. So 2 tablets on which were written the 10 Commandments. So giving them the 10 Commandments, so that happened at Mount Horeb. Let me see if you're talking about them coming down here. I'm going to have another slide a little further ahead that I think is going to show the route of the Exodus a little bit better. So we'll look at that in a bit. They come to the mountain of God. They receive the 10 Commandments, but because of their doubt and because of their fears, they end up wandering in the desert. Do you know approximately how long they wandered in the desert? Like, I don't know.
40 years.
Does that help you to figure out, like, maybe? Like there, anyone, any guesses at all? Any guesses at all? 40 years. Okay, yes, that's right. Okay. Anyone more than 39? Anyone? 40? Yes, 40 years. Okay. So 40 years wandering in the desert. Now this entire story is told in 4 books of the Bible. And so these will be, so now we're in the books of the Bible column. So these are the next 4 books of the Bible. We've done Genesis, which had a lot of stuff in it so far. But this entire story, then you'll want to write down here, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So there's some retelling of parts of the story. A lot of what's in these books have to do with the laws, not just the 10 Commandments, but a lot of the rituals and traditions, the institution of the priesthood, the sacrifices that they were to offer, the laws they were to observe, their journeys through the desert as the Lord fed them with bread from heaven, which they called manna. And what do they have to drink? Here, drink some sand. Here, have a nice glass of sand. No, that won't work. So they got water from somewhere. Moses he had a staff that he turned into a serpent at one time, but then so he struck a rock and water came out of the rock. So all these stories are really wonderful stories, and they're told through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Okay. So then eventually, though, they make their way into the promised land. Let me see if I have the map here. Okay. So here's a little bit of a better picture of how they got from Egypt. So we know where they were in Egypt, and then they make their way down into the Sinai Peninsula. So this is as we would know it today. And so theoretically, Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, or if you ask the kids, they call it Mount Cyanide. So that's Mount Sinai. You ask the kids, they don't. So they cross through the Red Sea. Here's kind of an indication of perhaps how they would have crossed over. You have a place where they come to the mountain of God, and then they wander and actually come into the promised land by crossing the river, this river that is north of the Dead Sea. That river is called the Jordan River, okay? And the first city that they're going to conquer, when they come through, they blow the trumpets and the fabled walls of Jericho come a-tumbling down. That's what the Music Man said. Do you remember that? No, okay. Okay, so from the Music Man, that's right. So music brought the fabled walls of Jericho down when they blew the trumpets. So the city of Jericho, so that's actually where they crossed over. The normal route to take would be to just follow along the coastal road. But so what ended up happening was something that was quite different. So it was a much different path. It shouldn't have taken 40 years, but the Lord caused them to wander in the desert because of their doubt. So let's now fill in what happens when we get to 40 years later. We're now ready to enter the promised land. Who's going to bring them into the promised land? Moses doesn't get to go in. He had doubted. He had disobeyed the Lord in the scene with the water from the rock. And so the Lord said, you will look, but you will not cross over. And so Moses dies on the far side of the Jordan. And so he does not cross over. Who goes after him? Let's see, you've got your books of the Bible open, and you're looking at Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. And the next person to bring them over in is Joshua, yes. So Joshua brings them into the promised land. So if we were to decide what book of the Bible we probably think that the story of Joshua is in, it might be the book of Joshua. There you are. So we write Joshua. Okay, so we're now at the book of Joshua. So one of the biggest things that happened is the conquering of Jericho. That's one of the biggest things. But also in the midst of that, the land itself, the promised land that had been promised to Abraham centuries and centuries earlier, before they went into Egypt and before they were enslaved and before they had to come back, was parceled out. And so then we have to then have an area where the various tribes would settle. And so each of them settled in parts of the promised land. Following this time of Joshua was then the period of the judges. And judges, we think of judge as someone in a black robe that's going to come up and settle a court case. But in this case, when they talk about judges, and there were historically 12 judges mentioned in what book of the Bible, I wonder, are the judges in? The book of Judges. Okay, so Joshua's story is told in the book of Joshua. The judges are told in the book of Judges. Here in this case, what happens is the Lord would raise up someone, and what a judge would be is someone who would be a temporary leader of one or more tribes of Israel, maybe not all 12 actually, but to help essentially fight battles, to lead the Israelites into various battles against the Philistines mostly, so against their adversaries. One of the judges, probably one of the most famous ones that people would remember, who never cut his hair, and he was extremely strong, but he was tricked and he was duped by Delilah, is who he was duped by. Does anyone remember that? Probably the one famous judge whose story you probably do know. Samson. Okay. Oh, like for example, Samson. And if you could, and if you were at all able to read, then you would have known the answer to that question. So there you are. So okay. So that's okay. I have to stand in front of it there. So there is one judge, but then there are a series of judges that are mentioned. Gideon is another famous one of the judges. Deborah, another one of the judges mentioned. But there are a series of them mentioned in that book. Okay, moving on from there, then we get to about 1020. So for a long period of time, there's no one ruler. When there's a problem, the judge comes along, and the judge is the one who works on this situation. Here's just an example of how the different tribes would have been organized in this period around the Promised Land. So each tribe was given its ancestral heritage. And so when they needed that, the individual judges would then be raised up to fight individual battles as they call upon the various tribes who would respond. But let's now continue forward as we are approaching, do I have 1140 on your?
Yes.
Okay, that's good, okay. We have to, before we get to 1020, this whole business about 1020 is the people are at some point are going to get upset and say, this judge thing just isn't working out. We need something a little bit more stable. We need a king. Okay, so eventually we're going to get to kings. So we need to start having a king. That's what we really need. But before we get to the king, there are a couple other stories to tell. And they're the stories of Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. Naomi and Ruth happen to be Moabite women. They are not Israelites. They are not from Israel. However, they end up following their Israelite husbands and coming into Israel. They end up coming into the Promised Land and end up converting. So it's actually kind of a beautiful story of the conversion of some who are not Hebrews, not Israelites, not descendants of Israel, but they join themselves to the Israelites. They become people who worship and follow the Lord. Ruth, who actually comes to the Promised Land and falls in love with and marries Boaz. Boaz, who's Boaz? Well, Boaz happened to be the father of Obed. Who's Obed? Obed happened to be the father of Jesse. Jesse happens to then be the father of David. So this is the great-grandmother of King David. And so it's an interesting little story. So Ruth's story, what an important person. As someone who was a convert to, this is important for RCIA, hey, how about that? As the convert to Israel, Ruth's story would be told in the book of, the book of Ruth. There you are, okay. So the book of Ruth. So it's a little aside, but we need to have that story told because it's going to get us to King David. Okay, so David was the first king, right? Anyone? No, David was not the first king. Who was the first king? When they finally said we have to have a king, then we have Samuel, who is the last of the judges, and he is the one who appoints for them a king. So the Lord says to Samuel, tells him who to choose, and so Samuel chooses Saul, and Saul is chosen as king. He has a son named Jonathan that's very important. Jonathan is actually very fond of David. And when David was first introduced to Saul, David wasn't actually, there was no thought of him being a king. Do you remember what his job was for Saul? He was actually one of Saul's helpers. He was actually his armor bearer. And he said, oh, send me into battle. This looks like an easy one. I bet I could win this one. Who'd he go into battle against? David and Goliath, yeah, okay. So this story is going to be told. This is the judge Samuel, who is the one who appointed Saul as king. This is going to be told in the book of 1 Samuel. And so you're going to have the entire story then of Samuel, how he was called, and then him selecting Saul and all the things that Saul did. Saul wasn't the best king. He disobeyed the Lord in some ways. But eventually, his armor bearer, David, who conquered Goliath, eventually he became the king after Saul. And that's because not only did Saul die in a battle, but his son Jonathan was also killed, so there was no heir. Instead, then David became the king. So there's a little bit of rivalry there. Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin. David was of the tribe of Judah, different tribes. So Benjamin and Judah, so which tribe is the kingly tribe? Well, it ends up really being Judah because of King David. So what did David do? David, among the other things he did, he founded the city of Jerusalem. So 1,000 years before Christ, Jerusalem was founded. The new city of peace, Jerusalem, that's from shalom, meaning peace. So Jerusalem actually is a part of the word of Jerusalem, means peace, shalom. He founded Jerusalem. He brought the Ark of the Covenant. What was the Ark of the Covenant? That was the thing that Indiana Jones rescued in the movie. There, it's right. Okay. And the Ark of the Covenant was first fashioned and created, remember, when they got the 10 Commandments. So ever since the 10 Commandments, they've been carrying around the Ark of the Covenant with the tablets inside. And David was the one that brought the Ark of the Covenant and brought it into Jerusalem. This is eventually would be placed within the temple to be built. David wasn't the one to build the temple, but and David had his first son Absalom, who turned against him, and it was actually a bitter part of this, which is going to be found in 2 Samuel. So here we're going to get part of the story of David in 2 Samuel, of the good things he did, but also the not so good things that he did, but including having to fight a rebellion against his own son who turned against him, and Absalom later was killed. But so this part of the story, the David part of the story, is going to be told in 2 Samuel, but you should also write down 1 Chronicles, because 1 Chronicles goes back and retells a lot of the story, but it's put in a more succinct fashion. But 1 Chronicles will also contain elements of the David story as well. Okay, so that gets us through David. Good. I think we're moving on from there. We can now put our first book in this next column, because the book of Psalms, many of the Psalms are attributed to David. So we know for sure David did not write all of the Psalms because of the content of the different Psalms. But some of the Psalms are attributed to David's time, and so we can actually, as someone who is kind of poetic, we can include David in this at this point and put him in connection with the book of Psalms. So let's move forward from there. Who came after David? After David his son was the wise Solomon. So we have Solomon the king, and he was the one to build the temple. David had been a king that had slain many people. He had shed much blood. It was not David's task to build the temple. So instead, Solomon, whose name in Hebrew is Shlomo, which comes from shalom. I know that sounds awful in English. But his name, Solomon and Shalom, also have a common root to them. So Solomon was more of a peaceful king, or his time was more peaceful. As he made many alliances and grew the kingdom, and it really reached its height under Solomon. However, Solomon became very foolish later in life. So unfortunately, he did not finish as well as he should have. His story is going to be told in 1 Kings and in 2 Chronicles. So in the books of the Bible, you have 1 Solomon, 2 Solomon, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles. Okay. 1 Samuel tells you about Saul. 2 Samuel tells you about David. 1 Kings tells you about Solomon, and then we're going to go on from there with 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles reprising the David and Solomon story, as well as the other kings to come after them. Okay. So from there, okay, that's quick little lesson on Solomon. What did Solomon do about when two women both claimed to be the mother of a child? Remember the wisdom of Solomon? He said, we'll cut the baby in half. Do you remember that? That's okay. And then the one mother that didn't want that to happen was the true mother. Anyway, so that's just one of the little stories about Solomon. So that's all in 1 Kings. Okay, so then after that, at the end of Solomon's reign, he had become quite foolish. And so at the end of that period of time, then the United Kingdom was now going to be divided. The 12 tribes that had all been together as part of one nation, as part of their division that occurred as part of the punishment because of sinfulness, the kingdoms were divided. And so you had northern kingdoms that broke away from the southern kingdoms. In the north, you have what they called the kingdom of Israel. 10 of the tribes broke away in the north, and so that is known as Israel. In the south, you have the kingdom of Judah. Judah was remained, that's where Jerusalem was. So they retained the temple, and with them, one more tribe stuck around, Saul's tribe, the tribe of Benjamin. So that's maybe they get the kingdom back, maybe someday. Let's say. So Benjamin and Judah remained in the south, and you have the remaining 10 tribes that broke away in the north. And so, and I forget if I've got let me see if I've got a map in here. So I'll back up to just to fill some things in here. But here's now where you have the divided kingdom. And so you have Judah in the south, which has Jerusalem. You have Israel in the north, which covers this entire area. Sea of Galilee. Okay, well, we know that from the New Testament. Okay, north. Dead Sea, south. Okay, Jerusalem, near the Dead Sea, near Jericho. Okay, so all that is the kingdom of Judah in the south. 10 tribes, the kingdom of Israel in the north. So backing up here, this divided kingdom, and really the story of all of the remaining kings are going to be told in these remaining historical books of 1st and 2nd Kings, as well as 2nd Chronicles. Here, you're going to get a lot of kings. You're going to get hundreds and hundreds of years of different kings. It's maybe not so important to write down Jeroboam and Rehoboam, but they were the first of those kings, the first of now 2 lines of kings, with the kingdom now being split. Jeroboam breaking away with the 10 tribes in Israel, Rehoboam remaining in Jerusalem with the 2 tribes, including Judah. Okay, so going forward from there, and there's our quick little map, which we just looked at. And from there, so now reminding ourselves of the divided kingdom, there is also now another moment here in which there's going to be a famous king who's going to have a famous encounter with a famous prophet. If there was ever one prophet that you might say really stands out, maybe someone who showed up later on at the Transfiguration, you might think of the great prophet from the Old Testament, Elijah. Okay, and Elijah had a confrontation with King Ahab. So this time, King Ahab and Jezebel. You ever remember Jezebel? Does that name ring a bell at all? Jezebel rings a bell. I guess it does. I didn't even mean for that. I didn't even mean to say that. Okay. So Elijah and then his successor Elisha. Their story is going to be told in 1st and 2nd Kings and in 2nd Chronicles. It's all continuing on. So the parts of the story are told actually in all 3 books. But this is part of where Ahab is a weak king and Jezebel is really running the show, and they end up killing off as many of the priests and prophets of the Lord as they can, but Elijah is the one that's remaining, and they have a famous showdown on Mount Carmel in which they see who can offer sacrifice to the real God. Which is real? Whose God is real? The Lord or Baal? And so they see who will send down fire upon a sacrifice. And Elijah is the one who's victorious in this great battle. It's a great scene, but Ahab and Jezebel, very, very bad. Very bad. Okay, northern kingdom. Okay, and Elijah is one of the prophets that is sent to them. Then we go forward a little bit from there, and now we're going to get to a very traumatic moment in the 700s BC, in which the Israel and Judah will be threatened by invaders coming from the north. We will see Assyrians that are going to be on the march. And during this period of time, Ahaz was in the southern kingdom of Judah, and he was really challenged by one of the prophets to really remain firm to the Lord. So part of the story of Ahaz is going to be told in 1st and 2nd Kings and 2nd Chronicles. But Ahaz would have been the king of Judah, who was told to trust the Lord. Do not worry. Israel, the northern kingdom, has been disobedient. They have sinned. They will be conquered by the Assyrians. But the king of Judah, you will remain firm. And so in 722, we have the northern kingdom falls. That's the end of the northern kingdom. Those 10 tribes are essentially wiped out. So the kingdom is brought to an end. It becomes incorporated into the Assyrian Kingdom at that point. Who was around in this period of time? So the 1st and 2nd Kings and 2nd Chronicles continue the story. And here's the Assyrian Kingdom. So Assyria is off to the north. So here's Syria, and here's the Assyrian Kingdom, including Nineveh. You might hear the town Nineveh that's mentioned in different places. Here's the Holy Land, and here's Jerusalem. So the Assyrian Kingdom had all of this fertile. You ever heard the Fertile Crescent? So that's what they kind of call this area. So that Fertile Crescent, Assyria was very much in power at that time. They wanted to take more territory, but they were not able to actually conquer Jerusalem. So where is some of this story told? We're going to come back with prophets because I revised this, and we'll fill in with the prophets later. So I'll tell you which prophets came in later. So also then during this time, let's also put Tobit and Judith down in here. Because these are two other small stories that actually center in Nineveh. And so this would have been around the time, especially when the northern kingdom was conquered and some of the people were taken to Nineveh. And so you have two different stories about Tobit and the things he did, and Judith. So all of that is set in Nineveh. I'll just put it in this time frame. But it's about individual people and their ways in which they're trying to the best of their ability to serve the Lord and what happens to them. Okay. So Tobit and Judith we'll put there. Then we have a few other kings that are worth mentioning. Josiah, we'll put him down. So now at this point, we just have Judah around. There's no northern kingdom anymore. Josiah was the king of Judah. We can put him around 640. And he was actually one of the great reformers. He was someone who, when they were repairing the temple, he said, we were like trying to patch a hole in the temple, and we were looking inside, and there was a book there. A book? Well, what kind of book was that? And they brought out these scrolls, and they realized that they had actually found the law. They had forgotten about the law. Here are the scrolls that told about the law of Moses. And they had found out that the people whose their hearts had grown cold, they had forgotten the law. They had forgotten their covenant with the Lord. And Josiah was one of the ones who helped recover the law and reread the law and then reproclaimed the law as a way of really trying to reconsecrate the people once again. Their stories continuing on, 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles. But then after that, eventually, we get to the fall of Jerusalem itself. So even though we have some noble examples in here with Josiah and Hezekiah and some of those others, this time they fall, but this is going to happen when the Babylonians take over. And so then we get to 586, the exile in Babylon. So we have the northern kingdom of Israel that falls to the Assyrians, but we also then will have the southern kingdom of Judah. It will fall. It fell to the Babylonians. There were kind of two phases to this, because first Jerusalem was conquered by the Babylonians in 598, but then eventually the city of Jerusalem was actually then destroyed in 586. So there are two different dates here, but it has kind of their initial being conquered, and then eventually, because they were told that they needed to cooperate with this. Because of their sinfulness, they were going to be sent into exile. Josiah's reforms were good, but it hadn't really changed the hearts of the people. And so the exile was coming. They needed to cooperate, but then, well, they rebelled. No, we're going to last. Nope, God said, no, you're really not going to. Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. So the city of Jerusalem itself fell. The temple was destroyed. It was no more. And this time then they were taken away from, so here we are in Judah. So here we have the Dead Sea and we have Jerusalem. They were eventually taken away not to Assyria. This time it was all the way over into Babylon. So this would be present day Iraq here. So to help situate, so there's your Persian Gulf. So they were taken away for a long period of time into exile. No temple, no Jerusalem, no priests, no sacrifices. What were they to do? So, but eventually, though, the time would come when the Babylonian exile would end. And so this would happen when Babylon ended up being taken over by another empire. Let me back up one scene here. So the Babylonians were eventually conquered by the Medes and another group that was off over here, actually the Persians. So eventually the Babylonian Empire would yield to the Persian Empire. I know some of these empires are probably not as familiar to us. Eventually we're going to get on to some that are going to be more familiar. So Assyrians and Babylonians and Medes and Persians, and then eventually Greeks. The Greek Empire. Okay, now they probably have heard of it. And then Roman Empire. Okay, that's what's coming. But for right now, the Persian Empire takes over. And the king of Persia then tells everyone, go back to your own native territory. So almost unexpectedly, hoping against hope, they get to go back to Jerusalem. And this story is going to be told in Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah, we have a prince and a scribe. Ezra the scribe and Nehemiah the prince of Judah. And so they are helpful in leading the people as they go back, reminding them of the covenant, and eventually helping with the reconstruction of the temple, the second temple. After the first temple, called the Temple of Solomon, then a second temple would be built in its place. So we get the building of the second temple. It takes a while to do that, so that's why you have 538 and then you have 520. So it takes them that long to actually get around to building the temple. Ezra and Nehemiah were on the case. They said, you need to get to this. You're wasting your time on yourselves. You need to be paying attention to the Lord. And then Ezra is a scribe, and Nehemiah was one of the princes or leaders of the people. Yeah. In this, we might also put the book of Esther, because this was the Persian Empire. Esther was a queen of Persia, and was able to save the people who were exiled in Persia. So I'll just put the book of Esther in this time frame because it fits within the Persian Empire. So we'll just put Esther there. Okay. Sometimes some of these shorter books, we can't tell every single story. Okay. Now what we're going to do is back up and we're going to fill in prophets. Okay. So going back to 740, I mentioned Ahaz. Who was the prophet that was telling Ahaz, trust, you will not fall to the Assyrians? That would have been one of the greatest of the major prophets. We've got three major prophets coming up. The first of those three major prophets, when you look at the prophets in there, want to take a guess? Isaiah. Yes, Isaiah. Yes, that's right. That's very good. Okay. So you have the prophet Isaiah. One of the things that I did for these is I put a couple of these in bold, because we have three major prophets and then we have 12 minor prophets. Now the minor prophets, I'm going to just put their names down. There's just not enough time to go into the detail about this. But here, in this period of time, you would have had other minor prophets, including Hosea, Amos, Obadiah, Micah, Jonah, and Nahum. They were all sent to specific places. So in some cases, you had Hosea and Amos trying to warn the northern kingdoms of Israel. You had a prophet sent to some of the Gentile areas, like the Edomites, of all things. Yeah. Micah was in the southern kingdom of Judah. And we have a couple people who went to Nineveh. Remember Jonah and the whale. Jonah he wasn't sent to Israel. He was sent to Nineveh. He was sent to an Assyrian city. So you have some of this. And I'll have copies of all of this on the website, that if you wanted to delve back in and get everything all real clear. So Can I move on from there? Do you want last chance? But you'll see it all eventually later. Okay. So then, now who else to fill in? During the time of Josiah, king of Judah, we have two other minor prophets. So here we'll put Joel and Zephaniah. So we can add two other minor prophets just to situate them in. So if you ever pick up that book and you say, what's going on? This is the time frame that this is in. But then we get to the great prophet. This is a major prophet, the one preparing them for exile, the one warning them, Jeremiah. So Jeremiah had a really tough job. Jeremiah was the one who had to say, you're going to be punished and you're going into exile. Get ready. So it's not, and were the people, oh, well, thank you, Jeremiah, for telling us that. Okay, no, Jeremiah suffered a lot because he had a very difficult message to give. Jeremiah is also associated with the time of exile, and with that would be Lamentations, the Lamentations of Jeremiah. So these are his woes, his sorrows. So some very sad things of coping with sorrow and adversity. So Jeremiah reflecting on sadness, Lamentations. And then Jeremiah also had a scribe. His scribe was named Baruch. So the book of Baruch is associated also with Jeremiah. So you have Jeremiah, Lamentations, and Baruch all essentially connected with the work of Jeremiah. Then we have also what we call second Isaiah. This is a little complicated, but the book of Isaiah, the first Isaiah that we met, is contained really in Isaiah's chapters 1 through 40. But then once you turn to Isaiah 41, and then you go from there to, I think, Isaiah 55, you can tell the context has changed. And then what ended up happening is that we might say that this part of Isaiah really is dealing with this section around the fall of Jerusalem. But it's written, you might say, in the spirit of Isaiah, but technically it is a part of Isaiah's book that is, more properly speaking, oriented toward this time around the fall of Babylon. And there's going to be a third Isaiah coming up a little bit later. So you have Isaiah 1 through 39, and then forward, beginning Isaiah 40 through 55. It's all in there. I just now that I said that, now I don't want to lead you astray here. But when you actually get to the first part of Isaiah, so the first Isaiah, the time having to do with the Assyrians, that would be 1 through 39. And then second Isaiah is considered Isaiah 40 through 55. Okay, sorry, I was right about that. And then we'll get to third Isaiah in a second. Okay. We can also put into this time frame Habakkuk, who spoke in Judah. So we've got one more. And then also the time while they were in exile, while they were in exile in Babylon is when the prophet Daniel was called. So he was called, the book says he was called in while they were in Babylon. But Daniel is one of those apocalyptic books. So Daniel's kind of the revelations of the Old Testament. So a lot of apocalyptic writings in Daniel. So a lot of symbolism and kind of some frightening things there. Okay. So then returning from exile. So who is the major prophet who helped them when returning from exile? We've seen Isaiah, we've seen Jeremiah. That would now be Ezekiel. But with that, we can also add third Isaiah. So a part of Isaiah, this would be Isaiah 56 to 66. This then enters into what the scholars would call third Isaiah, which is the part having to do with the return from exile. And then with that, we have a few other minor prophets. So we would put these, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. These would all be prophets that would have been called in the time after the exile, so the time of the restoration. So some of these would have been prophets who would have been telling them, build the temple, build the temple, build the temple. Don't pay attention to your own wishes. Don't build your houses first. Pay attention to the Lord. Make sure you don't forget the Lord. Okay, then we're going forward from there. So we've covered, that covers all of the minor prophets there. And now we get just some other books we have to kind of fill in. Various times, the book of Psalms. Some Psalms go all the way back to David, 1000 BC. Some Psalms go all the way up into the Babylonian exile and following. So the book of Psalms was written and compiled over a long, long period of time. So if you were to pick any individual psalm, then each individual psalm you might have to then figure out what its context is. But we can't situate the book of Psalms as if they were all written in one specific era. They really span too much space. And then we have other things that are called part of wisdom literature. These tell individual stories, but they're not really tied to any historic events. So with that, we will put Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Wisdom, and Sirach. So they contain, it's all part of the wisdom literature. It contains a lot of valuable information, but it's not tied to a historic moment. So I would just throw all of that together. Okay, am I okay? Can I move from there? Okay, so we don't have a date for those. And now we're at 333 BC. Who came to power in 333 BC? This is, if you know your history. Colin Farrell or Brad Pitt, or was it Colin Farrell that who played Alexander the Great? It's Alexander the Great. Okay, that's right. Who played, they did the movie with Alexander the Great, was that, who was it? You don't know. Okay. Well, how am I supposed to know that? No, there was a movie. It wasn't very good. It wasn't very good. So that's good. So I congratulate you on not knowing, because it was not a very good movie. So okay. But Alexander the Great came to power in 333 BC. So that was the beginning of the Greek Empire. And the Greek Empire would eventually span not just the little area of the Promised Land, or the Assyrians, or the Babylonians, or the Persians, or the Medes. Eventually, Greece ended up having influence throughout this entire area. So these empires keep getting larger and larger. So this would be the Greek Empire as it had come to power. The relevant part for our story has to do with around 167 BC, when there was Antiochus Epiphanes. He came into Jerusalem and he said, well, the Greek way is the best way. So we should all do exactly the same things, which means that we should speak Greek, and we should do things the way the Greeks do, and that includes worshiping the same gods. So therefore, enough with your gods. We're all now going to worship the Greek gods. And so they put a big statue of Zeus right into the temple. Okay, you think this went over? No, it did not go over. And so there was a rebellion. There was a revolt. The people were revolting. Yeah, tell me about it. They stink on ice. It's Mel Brooks. That's okay. So there was a Maccabean Revolt, and so Judas Maccabeus led the revolt, and eventually resisted to the point of finally driving out the influence of Antiochus Epiphanes. So the Judas Maccabeus, his story would probably be told in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Okay, so 1st and 2nd Maccabees has to do with 2nd century BC, this period of time of resisting the Greeks. Eventually, they had to reconsecrate the temple and relight the lights of the temple, and the Jews today call that the celebration of Hanukkah. So Hanukkah comes from the relighting and rededication of the temple after the Greek desecration. Then by 64 BC, we now get to the point where the Roman Empire, now the Roman Empire existed before 64 BC, but as far as the Holy Land is concerned, by approximately 64 BC, this would have been when the Roman Empire was now exerting influence in Judea. And now it sounds like we're getting a lot closer to 1 AD or thereabouts. And so now let's go to, technically we say this is 4 BC. 4 BC, the birth of Jesus. We know this because the Gospels tell us that Herod the Great wanted to put all of the children to death that were born at a certain time. And then Mary and Joseph had to take Jesus and flee to Egypt in order to protect the Christ child until Herod died, and then they came back. Well, we know Herod the Great died in 4 BC, so we actually date the birth of Christ to 4 BC. I know that sounds weird because it sounds like we were off a little bit. We should say 1 AD, well, okay, 4 BC. So, and then the birth of Jesus, and then eventually, then we have his public ministry. So Jesus' public ministry, the 3 years of his public ministry from 27 to 30 AD. And this will be told in the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay, so we've got the Gospels. Okay, I'm not going to tell you the whole story of Jesus. We got all year to talk about that. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John would have that. I started just a couple minutes late, so I'm going to just squeeze a couple minutes so I can still stay within my 60 minutes. After 30 AD, after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, then we have his ascension into heaven. And after his ascension, then we have the Holy Spirit coming down at Pentecost. And once the Holy Spirit comes down at Pentecost, we begin now the apostolic era. So Jesus is ascended back into heaven, and now the apostles start to carry the gospel to the ends of the earth. So the apostles, what book would tell the acts that they performed? What acts were performed by the apostles? They would be described in the book of Acts. Okay, the Acts of the Apostles. Okay, so there we've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then Acts is a really strictly historical book. It really is. It's a book really of history. So then after that, then between 48 and 60 AD, this is a period of time that really is now given over to St. Paul. And St. Paul travels through, St. Paul is converted, and he travels through Corinth, Galatia, Ephesus, Philippi, Colossae, and Thessalonica. And he liked them so much he wrote them letters. So there, he wrote to Corinth. The people of Corinth he wrote to them twice, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And to the people of Galatia, he wrote to them in the book of Paul's letter to the Galatians. Ephesus, he wrote to the Ephesians, good. The Philippi, he wrote to the Filipinos. Sometimes if you listen to the lector, I've heard it before. I said, reading from the letter of St. Paul to the Filipinos. No, Philippians. He wrote to the people of Colossae. They were the Colossians. He wrote to the people of Thessalonica. And he wrote to them twice. Thessalonians. Okay, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Paul wrote another letter to people he hadn't met. One more letter, Romans. Okay, so here is a map of some of the different journeys Paul made. I was looking for different maps, and this is actually very detailed, but very hard to see from a distance. So Paul at first made some journeys and went a little ways. And then his second journey, he comes from Jerusalem and he goes more over. And his third journey, he goes and he does this and he does this and he does more. And his fourth and final journey is the one that actually is going to take him all the way to Rome. And this is the one where he really was in prison. And so there, in anticipation of a visit, he wrote to the Romans. But the Romans would be the one letter that he wrote to people he hadn't yet visited. He was planning on coming, so he wrote to them in advance. In all of these other cases, he had actually been there and had evangelized them and brought them the gospel and is writing to them to encourage them after having met them. In this case, he was writing really one of his great theses, his kind of great treatise on Christianity, so it's comprehensive, the book of Romans, great book, but writing to them knowing that he was hoping to come or planning to come, and perhaps even go on from there even to Spain, but that was not what was to happen. So then in the first century, 48 to 60 AD, there was also Paul's personal letters. He wrote to some individual people personally. This was not written to groups of people, but he wrote to Timothy. He wrote to Timothy twice. He wrote to Titus, and he wrote to Philemon. So these are personal epistles of Paul, but he writes to individual people. So we put them down as Paul's epistles, but written personally. And then we also have in here other pastoral letters, just sometime in the first century. So these were not written by Paul to James, John, Peter, and Jude, but they were written by James. Okay, so you have James wrote one letter, Peter, 1 Peter, 2 Peter. So Peter wrote 2 letters. John wrote 3 letters, and then Jude, the Apostle Jude, Simon and Jude. Okay. A special category is the letter to the Hebrews. We really don't know who wrote it. For a while, it was kind of attributed to Paul, but the letter itself has its own style. Scholars are not convinced that it was written by Paul. The letter doesn't say who wrote it. It just says it was addressed to the Hebrews. So we don't really have authorship, but that also would be another first century writing. Following that, 64 AD, who died in 64 AD? Peter. 67 AD, Paul was martyred. So we can put down the martyrdom of Peter and the martyrdom of Paul as 64 and 67. And then in 70 AD, another major event happened. So finally, it happened once before when the Babylonians came in. Happened once again when the Romans came in. They destroyed Jerusalem. So the temple was once again destroyed. City of Jerusalem fell a second time, burned to the ground by the Roman Empire, 70 AD. In here, we would also put somewhere in this time frame the book of Revelation. Revelation's attributed to John, so it would be part of John's body of work. We have John's gospel and the three letters, the three epistles of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Revelation. All those books are attributed to John. And there is your Daniel of the New Testament, Daniel, the apocalyptic book of the Old Testament, Revelation, the apocalyptic book of the New Testament. And once the last apostle died, then you have the end of the apostolic era, and that is the end of public revelation. That's the end of the deposit of faith closed. If you remember from last week, we talked about the deposit of faith. So then it was closed at that point. Everything necessary for salvation had been revealed, and we have then the totality of Scripture. Though it would eventually be compiled, it would take a little time before that was all established. But everything that we have in Scripture is written from the period of time of the apostolic era. Okay. So in 61 minutes, I think, then we've covered that. For the purposes of the recording, we'll just conclude from here. And we'll just say, glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. For the recording, the copies of the presentation and the sheets to be filled out, I will link to those descriptions, and so people can watch that from there if they would like to follow along in greater detail.